start. I'm Phil Antón. I'm the chief scientist here at AIRC, but in this role, I'm a lowly researcher, and we were actually asked by Miss Tori Cuff, and also work with Scott Smith, who I'll introduce in a minute. Tori's question to me was, what kinds of future things could we do? The department was looking at something called BA8. They wanted to have more responsive appropriations for software development. So they created what sort of a single category for money, so that whether it's development or sustainment, however you want to categorize it, they had more ability to react to specific needs as they're doing development. She asked me, so well, what else could we do if this was wildly successful? What other kinds of things could the department do? So I pulled together some thoughts, and I'm going to run that by you, but I wanted to give Scott an opportunity to say anything about this, and then we'll dive into the briefing. Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Smith. So I took over from Tori briefly while she was doing some parent leave, then she came back, and then she left again. So now I'm actually fully in charge of the things that she passed on to me, budget activity 8 being the most important one. This was her idea, as Phil said, and it was a great idea. Really love to think about differently about how we can do things between us and the Hill. Sort of heard my question in the other room about how we can think differently between us and the Hill. The BA8 is not going swimmingly. It's going, certainly, but it's not going to prove anything one way or the other, I don't think. We'll learn something, and we certainly learned about how to do a single appropriation for software. But I think the even better ideas are still out there, and I think we're going to hear some fun ones here today. But sorry.
Great, thanks, Scott. So I'm going to proceed and, like I said, embarrass myself. But this was some of the motivations as we thought about it. You said, well, you all either know this or you've heard some of it. I think this morning, the department tends to think about acquisition programs, but then we're trying to integrate them into mission capabilities and portfolios and kill chains and all of these kinds of things. It's very orthogonal. So how can you sort of expect the department to manage by portfolios? And this is something that Congress is asking the department, when you actually provide the money by program. So it's in a different continuity, and so it sort of rubs you the wrong way. Another challenge is we get new threats. The threats operate much faster than the normal budgeting process is 2 years. Yes, there are ways of changing it faster. We could get into that. Technology is changing right every 2.5 years, sort of in a new generation, especially on software development. But how can you manage and produce it that way when you're on a different timeline, basically? So what kinds of things could we be doing to think about authorizations and appropriations so that the department can have money and allow it to move in that particular level? So what I thought about was, well, how would we tackle this thing, other than I can make up ideas, which there are some in here, but I thought, well, what are the fundamental things that drive Congress? We got a little bit of that just before this with the PSMs about what is it that's driving Congress. So I thought, well, let me create a framework, and we'll write down the equities. From at least my perspective, we're starting to write down these equities about what drives Congress and what drives the Department of Defense at a very high level. Fundamental things. We're supposed to be funding national security. This level of thing. Enduring, we need to make certain the department's equipped. We need to have basic oversight. Congress has an oversight role of the executive branch. Same thing on the DoD side. Well, I have a strategy and a mission that is handed me by the president, and there are large policies and structures framed by Congress. They also have to execute oversight of acquisitions and go ahead and field them and so on. So what are these kinds of equities there? Where are the tensions? And can we use this as a way to then take new ideas and try to decide what to do about it? So I'm going to sort of quickly go through that. For those of you that don't know the appropriation structures, again, they're by programs of record. And we could talk offline about what that means, but think about it as buckets, right? Even within a program, they have research, development, test, and evaluation in 7 different types of buckets. They have something called procurement and something called operation and maintenance. So they're all very separated types of money, and you're supposed to predefine, oh, I'm going to need some R&D here. I think I'm going to need some operation maintenance over there. And, if you have too much in one bucket when you're actually executing, life is difficult. You also have a certain amount of time that you have to be able to spend it. So if it's operation and maintenance, you're supposed to do it in the same fiscal year that it's authorized and appropriated to you. If it's RDT&E, it's 2-year money and so on. So they have different kinds of lengths of period in which you can address it, which also sort of ties your hand as you're trying to deal with it. So I'm going to quickly go through some of these examples of equities to think about. So, again, on the congressional side, well, they framed the basic mission. What is this Department of Defense anyways? What is it trying to do? We authorize wars. We set the basic structure of the Department of Defense. They're constantly, sort of changing things on the margins, moving undersecretaries around and so on. On the Department of Defense's side, well, we're trying to meet those missions, right? The department talks about what the mission, well, they come from someplace else, as we said, POTUS and other DoD leaders, and they have to operate within these basic structures, and those are pretty straightforward. If you go down the next level in this table, you say, well, Congress receives the budget request, right? The staffers were talking about that earlier, right? There's a president's budget request that goes over to the Hill. Congress takes that, they make marks and adjustments. They can do really basically anything they want to it. They could throw it out if they wanted to. They tend not to. They tend to adjust from there, and then hand that back basically in authorizations and appropriations to the department, who has to take that and try to deal with what they've been handling. They've optimized it at some level based on their analyses, and now they've been handed a budget that's a little bit different, and they have to go off and deal with it. So there's some tension there, depending on how much has changed through the budget authorization appropriations. The Congress has a duty to make certain, that the department has the resources that they need to be able to pursue. That's the C4. But what is Congress? Congress is a representative body made up of, political members. So there is a little bit to some level of, well, where's the money? Am I getting resources for my district? There's some of that going on. We didn't spend the time to try to assess how much of it is. I know it's up and down. Ability to earmark is lower right now, but there is some inherent tension between, what's the best thing for the department and what's the best thing for my district. And you can see some of those underlying. I've had indications from from some of the folks I've talked to say, well, really the Hask and Sask really do focus on the mission much more than these political aspects on it, but there is that inherent undertone. On the DoD side, they have to execute and oversee acquisitions to be as cost effective as possible, and they're still trying to optimize. So you've heard of things say like base alignment enclosures. If there's a resource, it's in one state and I need to move it and consolidate to someplace else. Well, now you have, senators and Congress folks to engaging on that level to impede that ability. And again, some tension with Congress on it. Another areas where Congress, of course, controls the major spending decisions, right? They provide the money and they say what you can do with that particular money. They do long-term and are worried about long-term capabilities. And there's some inherent tension there about, well, what's the right way to spend? And is it a long-term vision or a short-term area? And they also try to avoid tying the hands of future Congresses, right? So they tend to try to localize it within at least preferably that fiscal year, but not too many fiscal years out. And that's where you get some of these time constraints going on. On the DoD sides, yes, they have to follow the controls that Congress has handed. And the department's constantly thinking about, and there's an inherent tension between short-term and long-term. Is there something that I need right now, or do I have to build for the future, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years out? And they also struggle with this immediate 1 year kind of money versus long year money. So there are things like multi-year appropriations. There are systems that take a long time to build, aircraft carriers and submarines. Just building the hull itself takes a long time. So yes, if they had an ability to spend in the long term, you can get some efficiencies out of it, but then that ties Congress's hands. You again get tensions between the two. Again, here, building for current needs and building for future needs, we see that on both sides. Congress worries about it and the department worries about it, and there's natural inherent tension there and some level of balance between it. There's always this question about where do you set those balances. And then there's oversight. Congress wants to make certain that the department's performing properly, that we're getting, value for the money, and the department has that as well, making certain that, we're executing properly and tailoring it. So if you sit down and think about it, these are all in a table, right? I'm sure I'm missing things, but it's a start at trying to think about, well, what is it that we're doing? What I try to do then is say, here's some ideas on the left-hand side. Here's some things that we could do. We could say, well, don't give me money by program. Give me money by portfolio area. Give me anti-submarine warfare money, right? Give it in that category. I may need a new sensor this year. I may need a transportation platform. I need a new weapon system and so on, all targeted at, say, anti-submarine warfare. If you do it that way, then the department has an ability to think and manage within there, make those trades, look at threats, deal with it. It's all topical. It's still controlled by something that Congress is doing. But of course, what are we doing? We're now opening up the aperture. It could be on any program that relates to that portfolio. So at some level, from a congressional perspective, I would probably sit there and argue and say, well, wait a minute, you've made it much more, flexible and responsive. That's great for you, but it doesn't help me in my ability to try to control it. So the idea was take the framework and step back and say, well, what can I do to kind of rebalance it? Is there more information that I can provide in compensation for more responsive flexibility in these particular areas? So some of these are responsive types of things that we could do. Others are compensations given those priority, those equities that we're saying. So can we give more information and compensation for more flexibility? Can we provide earlier information? Can we provide more additional later information? If you give me a pot of money, can I go over in a very short amount of time and tell you what I did with that? Is that satisfactory? So thinking about those in particular areas, we think is a way to try to walk through particular ideas, of which these are some. They're more in the report that we're getting ready to produce, but then also thinking about rebalancing as a way of dealing with it. Some of these are at the boundary between the DoD and Congress. I think Congress probably would prefer that we solve it within the department's purview. But some of those are also there in terms of other aspects that was raised earlier in terms of transparency. The department, some of you may be aware, provides justification books for the president's budget. So, there's a top line, there's some summary documents, and then there are large volumes of information that produces it. In some level, it's really hard to get information out of this. I as an analyst will oftentimes plow through there to try to get information about what's really going on in there. But I know I've heard some Hill staffers say it's just the most grueling thing I've ever had to try to get out of that the information that I want. So transparency, ease of insight into the information, that again could be something that we could provide to compensate as we go through it. So next steps are we're producing a report on this as a ways of introducing ideas. These are some of the stakeholders that we could go and talk to try to see, is there resonance with any of these areas? Are there things that we're missing? Are there other aspects that we could throw into this and use? Basically, it is to use the framework as a way of trying to think through how do we actually make authorizations and appropriations, much more responsive so that the department can deal with it, but not in a way where you just say, well, ideally, it's like, just give me all a big pot of money and I'll do the right thing by you. Well, that's not going to happen. We need to have it in a way that allows the department to do it, but still gives Congress an ability to control where it's going, see where it's going, produce oversight, insight, make certain that people are performing properly. There's nothing mischievous, there's nothing illegal going on in there. But how do we do that in a way that allows the department to move up to a level from individual programs to these net capabilities that are out there? So I don't know, Scott, if you have any other thoughts or insights from the department's perspective, and happy to answer any questions.
More words in the paper than what you've said, so there is more to look forward to when it comes out in terms of some of the ideas. But for example, one of the things we kick around is, hey, here's something we could try, which is crazy, but and I think we've at some point pass this along to appropriation staff to just sort of casually request their interest. But what if we didn't know what appropriation it was until we actually put it on a contract? What would that do to the whole system? So that's just one type of example of things that we could look at, but there are certainly other things that are going to be in the paper as well.
Right. And even in this BA8 area, this was something that we're talking to Ms. Cuff about. Once we get it, we can still track how we spent it. So it's not RDT&E and procurement. It's a booked as RDT&E, but that's just someplace to park the money. But it would be fascinating for, at least for the internal of the department and probably for the Hill, to say, well, actually this year I spent this much in RDT&E and this much in procurement and this much in O&M. And then the next year it flipped on its end, or it didn't flip on its end. Or how did your actual spending profile compare to what you might have budgeted if it wasn't all in BA8? Was it the same anyways? And we, didn't make any difference. It was BA8 thing was just, another bookkeeping exercise, or was it radically different? So how much did you actually change over time? So there are lots of ways of taking some of this information and help informing internally in the department what's really going on. And I think also helping the Hill understand, well, what are we doing with these resources in ways that we hadn't otherwise. Right now, the BA8 is just a common bucket of money, but there are ways of tracking it because we already have those capabilities now as we're tracking in these budgetary accounts. And so we could do that as a way of getting more data and insight into, is it useful? Is it not useful? How much did we actually change? So that we can make decisions at least at the BA8 level, but also the same thing with these other areas. Continue to, if we bucket in a particular area, we can continue to track it in different ways, ex post, as a way of informing and seeing what's really happening, and then deciding, is this useful or not? So, any questions from the audience?
In this morning's panel that stuck with me because it resonates with me from kind of current state of most of our capabilities and new acquisitions is from software, not hardware. But one of the comments that came out in the earlier panel is this whole concept of RDT&E versus O&M being defunct and not in pace with what industry's doing. And so I wonder how, when you take a look at this and think about these pots of money, how you would think about advising on any changes that need to happen if that is actually the case.
So that's a lot of what drove the BA8 question. If you think about software, so, well, I'm making a change. The system's deployed. Is that research and development, or is that maintaining the system? And you could kind of say, well, it's both. It's really hard to make those kinds of determinations. And there are people that take O&M and do things that sound like development, and
you will definitely, yeah.
But there are also.
Well, I think the bottom line is you spend what you have, and you're as creative as you need to be to do that.
Yeah.
But we have another question, sorry.
Yeah.
So I liked the idea of appropriate or authorized by portfolio and report by program. For something like that, would you imagine that the program level would include like a fit-up estimate, or would that only go through like actuals or only through the president's budget?
So I can imagine things like, well, Congress has control before you start a new program. I still want you to come talk to me. Okay, yeah, it's anti-submarine warfare. Yeah, I know I gave you a big pot of money, but I don't want you starting a new program without me. So that is something that Congress could still retain and yet provide it in a portfolio level. So there's some of those you could put boundaries on it. You could say, well, wait a minute, I don't want you getting rid of basic research, right? So there's some trade-offs between, right? Remember we talked about the distant future, we could think about that's basic research, and then the current things are more immediate applications of COTS and mature technologies and O&M and procurement. So maybe I put a bounds around, the minimum amount when you add it all up, because you're supposed to be bookkeeping this for me anyways, right? I want you to have at least this much in what you normally would have called 6.1, 6.2 research as a sort of a min max, so that you're putting some kind of guardrails on it. I don't want you eating the seed corn, but I'll give you some some responsiveness and ability to adjust within some levels of boundaries so that, you know, I still have that kind of oversight function. That's what some of the things I used to look at or say, well, how much are we spending in RDT&E, and is, you know, O&M eating our lunch, those kinds of things. But that's again another way of trying to introduce some level of responsiveness while still allowing the kind of strategic control that at least I would imagine, not being on the Hill, I can imagine them saying that, you know, that was my whole intent anyways. I want to make certain you don't kill DARPA, you don't kill basic research in those areas. So right, it's trying to think through that, and as Scott indicated, we have a number of these ideas. We didn't do sort of a lit review of all the things that are going on, and there is a PPBE commission going on and thinking through a lot of these activities, but we wanted to collect some of those and then throw them at the framework to try to exercise the process. I mean, I should also add, was peace 2 minutes? 2 minutes. There are some things that are just within the department's control. This is probably something that I can well imagine Congress saying, you know, fix your own house before you come talk to us. So if you go and look at the federal, FM financial management regulation, it's huge. I mean, it's thousands of pages long. It's just insanely complicated. Not being a comptroller, there are things probably in there where we could simplify it. And you say, well, do I really care if it's O&M or RDT&E? You know, what is the difference between the two? And maybe there are categories where I shouldn't care and I don't really care, and you know, go off and make the right decision. So 1 minute. Yes, sir.
If I could foot stomp one thing. I think you were getting to it with the industry also having a different perspective on the division between the dollars, but really it comes down to change is hard and change within, like when we try to do change just across all the department enterprise, that's hard. But trying to change across the department and the legislative branch all at the same time and envision a new process, that's going to be even harder. It'll be really interesting to see what happens.
Great. So I am out of time, so I want to turn over. Yes, what is this? Good job. So next up is Megan Nix and Laura Freeman, who are going to talk about data side. So my other life is related to how can we actually help the department get data, share the data, get data to the right people that can do development. So I'm going to turn that over to Mark. And you want to introduce Mark? Okay.
Mark's already been introduced today. All right, well, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Mark Kritzko, who is the Principal Deputy Director for Enterprise Information Acquisition Data and Analytics in OUSD A&S, and the sponsor of the Digital Data Strategy Task and the Digital Data Pilots Task and the AIRC, of which we'll be talking about a core component today, Darcy. So Mark, over to you.
Let me see. Did we put our?
I thought they just got magic.
All right, so I'll just wing it while we're up here. You saw the framework of analytics today. Of how do we think about innovation? You also heard under the digital data strategy. Okay, there we go.
I'll forward your slide so you can be.
There's only two. So you know what, I can talk forever and I'm going to try to get off the foundation. And you heard Ron talk about it this morning. The underlying is digital data strategy. So what does that really mean and how do we think about it? And we have some really great researchers here and working through this problem. It's a hard one for the Department of Defense. It's hard for industry. Go to the next chart, please. This is where it all is. We're going to talk about one segment of what we think about in terms of Darcy. But as we have thought about, and Laura and team have done just such a great job looking across this, of what does that really mean to have a digital acquisition data strategy when we have a digital engineering strategy? How do the two connect and where are we? And what do we bring about in terms of that? We have laws in terms of 836. We have ideas where we're trying to innovate and go through it. I was a few minutes late because I really wanted to hear about there's different IAPRs. And Dave Tremper, how does data fit into what he needs to accomplish there? Portfolio analysis, how do we use tools and techniques? Lindsay, thank you very much. I'll be sure you're awake in the back room, on the digital Grand Prix. How do we use that there with DLA and different problems? We're gonna talk about Darcy, and what does that mean? Simple. How many in here are researchers? How many have ever been awarded something from the Department of Defense, go research? Like money? Like we gave you money to do something.
Are you looking for a trophy?
What's your first question? Where's the data? And you're like, you're revving up to work. And you're like, where's the data? And after you get through that trough of disillusionment, then it's going to take 30% of your award and 6 months to get to it, and somebody beating on you for your research. How do we solve that problem? And that is such a classic problem for the Department of Defense. So one of the chores that I asked, are there tools, techniques that we should look at? Can we solve and rethink our problem? I will tell you, no offense to my distinguished colleagues, didn't solve it. But we're well on the path of thinking through that. Because there's tools, techniques, policy, and operations that we're going to have to mature into. And I am extremely interested because they always come to me, oh, you're the data guy. How do you get the data? Well, I knock on the same doors you do. Scott, when you were in the department, they would beat on you. Where's the data? I think it's really interesting, and they've done great research. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to that. But I wanted to lay out that problem so you can see the reality of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. That the best setup for Darcy that you could imagine.